Good evening, everyone. Good evening. On behalf of the people and the clergy of Church of the Holy Communion, I welcome you to the latest installment of our annual speaker series, which is made possible through generous estate gifts from the Kesmar and Lancaster families and our partnership with Calvary Episcopal Church. Holy Communion is a community of teachers and learners. We celebrate questions and we walk together as we seek the truth. Our speaker series has hosted such notable guests as Anne Lamott, Phyllis Tickle, Walter Brueggemann, and Elaine Pagels. Our guest this evening continues this tradition of pursuing an understanding of faith that is both intellectually rigorous and socially active. Father Greg Boyle is a Jesuit priest and the founder of Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles. Homeboy Industries provides hope, training, and support to more than 10,000 formerly gang-involved and previously incarcerated people every year. It shows God's unconditional love to some of the people who need it the most. In a recent interview with Krista Tippett, Father Boyle said this with regard to urban peacemaking: "I'm old-fashioned. I think peacemaking requires conflict, and it's important to say that there's no conflict in gang violence. There's violence, but there's no conflict, so it's not about anything. It's about the lethal absence of hope. Homeboy Industries saves lives by providing hope." It's a great pleasure for me to welcome to this sanctuary a minister of such influence, impact, and insight. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Father Greg Boyle and his friends Jason and Omar.
Good evening. On behalf of myself, my homeboy Omar, and Father Greg, Homeboy Industry, I want to thank you for inviting us and having us here. My name is Jason. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California, in a low-poverty area. I was born and raised by my grandmother. My mother was a 40-year drug addict. I never grew a bond with her. I never had a father in the household. So instead of me going to a foster care or DFC picking me up, my grandmother took me in. I can say at the age of 14, I was looking for acceptance. I didn't have a father in the household. I didn't have nothing but women in the home. And now I see why today all my homeboys say, "You're an emotional man." They say I'm so emotional and sensitive, but I have to tell them I was raised by all women. But at the age of 14, like I said, I was looking for acceptance, didn't have a father in the home. I jumped off the porch and started hanging with the guys in the neighborhood. I was a young guy trying to make a name for myself, looking for acceptance once again. I started hanging with these guys on the corner that I've known. I used to see them in their nice fancy cars, and they had all the little money, and so I wanted to be a part of that. To make a long story short, I started gangbanging. Do I regret it? Yes, I do. Today, I walk my own 2 feet. I no longer let one man dictate what I do. I ended up catching an 18-year sentence. I've been home for 4 months now. I just did 15 years, 8 months. During my stay incarceration in prison, I used to see documentaries about Homeboy Industry. I used to be like, who is this guy, this bald head guy right here that's doing all this talking? Whoever thought that I'd be a part of this man's organization? Homeboy Industry, like he said, It supports and help us previously incarcerated men and women. Today, I no longer gangbang. I'm at Homeboy Industry. I'm working right next to my rival enemies were the guys who I thought were my rival enemies. I used to let the devil rent space in my head. Today, I no longer do that. Today, I've learned to value other people's lives just as myself. Since I've been at Homeboy Industry, I'm actually a month and a half away from getting my GED. I'm certified in CPR. If somebody was to go down right now, who would think this gangbanger helping? I help you right now. I'm certified in forklift. I got certified in OSHA 10, and I got certified in hazmat. But all this came through the blessings of Homeboy Industry. Today, I no longer want to fly with the pigeons. I want to soar with the eagles. While I was incarcerated, I lost my mother. My mother passed away. My father passed away. Something my mom always told me. She said, I want you to get out, do right, and take care of your kids. So today, once again, through Homeboy Industry, I'm taking parenting classes. At the age of 37, I just realized that parenting don't stop. I'm still learning. I got a daughter that's 20 and a son 17, and they driving me crazy. But through Homeboy Industry, once again, it's helping me. And Homeboy Industry is not just about employment. It's getting to learn yourself, who you are. And that's where I'm at today at Homeboy Industry through the blessings, Father Greg and the man upstairs. I just want to thank y'all for letting me be here and share a short story. Thank you.
You know, he went first. He was supposed to make it easier for me. Didn't work. Didn't work at all. But sorry. She's gonna share a little bit about myself, right? Like I didn't grow up wanting to be a gang member. Not at all. I ended up running away when I was 13, and part of that was because my father had passed away, and I guess he had passed away, and I never got that kind of like that acceptance from him, saying that feeling worth it, right? I never felt worth it, like worth anything. So that was part of why I ran away, and then I kind of the first day that I ended up joining my gang a year later, I got shot at the first day. I didn't get hit, but that day I knew, that my life was gonna be short. So I kind of gave myself that end date where I'm gonna die at 18, and that was that, So, and I was okay with it. And then time went on. I met Father Greg. It wasn't gonna work. The program wasn't gonna work because I knew my faith at the time, right? And like years later, I ended up I got laid off along with 300 others back in 2010, and I had like this pretty, like really heart-to-heart conversation with Father Greg, and I was 19 at the time, and after that conversation, I actually started to think about a future, and maybe like a day or two later, I ended up getting shot. I got shot, I don't even know, 6 to 7 times, one of which was to my head, and affected my whole right side, and my confidence, everything. I had a baby at the same time. So all these emotions, all this anger, just anger on top of anger, And then I ended up coming back to Homeboys years later because nobody else would hire me. But the program's not gonna work unless you want it. If you're not here for you, it's not gonna work. So it wasn't, it was never gonna work. Until I came back and I finally started doing classes, and I started doing therapy, and I started doing all the service that Homeboys offers, and I started to accept. Like I never had that acceptance from my father, and I did end up having it, but I just never accepted it from Father Greg. But today I do, and been sober for a bit, but I'm working on it. And everything's changed, I'm a father of 2 now. I got so many goals. I've been traveling, and life has changed completely for the better since I've been at Homeboys. So, I don't know.
Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be with all of you, and it's the privilege of my life to know Jason and Omar, who have a lot of history, and happy to have them here with us. So for 34 years, I've worked with gang members, and I'm so grateful for that experience, and they've taught me everything of value, and the day will never come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I am closer to God than the thousands of men and women I've been privileged to know. People like Luis Perez, he was a force of nature. He was worked at Homeboy for a time, and good guy, and did a lot of things, and he was a speaker. He would be invited to speak at all sorts of things, and then he became kind of in demand, and so we went out to dinner, just the two of us, and he was giving me tips on how to speak publicly. And he said, you have to pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. And I said, yeah, no shit. It was some good advice there. So brace yourselves. So I think there's just a kind of a thing that brings you to this church tonight, and it's not the three of us. It's really your own sense of vision and how you want to imagine the world looking differently than it currently looks. Mother Teresa said the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we stand against forgetting that? How do we, with God, imagine a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle? How do we together dismantle the barriers that exclude? You come to the city, and I think a lot about Martin Luther King, and I remember that day so well, 50 years ago, almost. And what Martin Luther King used to say, if church could well be said of our brief time together tonight, it's not the place you've come to, it will always be the place you go from. And you go from here to imagine a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. And so we're all invited in our way, in our own particularity, to stand at the margins, because the truth of the matter is, if we stand at the margins will get erased just because of our location. And so we stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and we stand with those whose dignity has been denied. And we stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And every once in a while, everyone in this room, I suspect, has had that privileged grace to be able to stand with somebody who was easily despised and readily left out. We get to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. So I suspect if kinship happened to be our goal, we would no longer be promoting justice, we'd be celebrating it. For no kinship, no peace. No kinship, no justice. No kinship, no equality. No matter how singularly focused we may well be on those worthy goals, they actually can't happen unless there's some undergirding belief that we belong to each other. And so we go to the margins and we brace ourselves because people will accuse us of wasting our time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." And you go to the margins and voices other than our own get heard. None of that makes any sense unless we are anchored in the God who loves us without measure and without regret. Everything is utterly dependent on how we see God. I had a spiritual director years ago that said, "You know, we need a better God than the one we have." He was a Jesuit. But I know, we all know what he means, that sometimes our God can be tiny. We settle for a partial God, a lesser God, a more realistic God than the God we actually have. And there are signs abound. God is always dropping anonymous tips and dropping hints. I think of Dylan Roof, who killed all those folks in the church at Mother Emanuel Church. And was a week later, maybe, when family members of those who had died stood in front of him and said, "We forgive you." And you knew you were in the presence of the God we actually have. But then, 9 months later, when he was sentenced to die and people called it God's justice, you knew we had wandered back to the lesser God, the partial God, the more realistic God. St. Ignatius of Loyola always talks about the God who's always greater. How do we locate that? If I could speak personally, I just buried my mom last week, or 2 weeks ago, I guess now, or 10 days ago. She was 92 years old. She was real sharp till the end. She had 8 kids. Although once in the last 2 weeks, when she was kind of going in and out of coherence, I was testing her mental agility. I don't know why I was doing that, but I said, "Hey, it was just the two of us, how many kids do you have?" 2. I said, "Really? What are their names?" Eileen and Maureen, which are the names of my 2 oldest sisters. I have 5 girls and 3 boys. And I said, "Really, Eileen and Maureen?" And then she said, "I just love them. I'm so happy with them." And I said, "You didn't have any other kids?" "Oh, no." Oh, 2 is plenty. But she didn't fear death at all, She, at one point she was just reaching up to the sky, and she would say, "I'm so happy to be going home." And once she, months and months ago, she, with kind of an odd exhilaration, she said, "I've never done this before," It was something you'd say just before skydiving, And I would always I'd dinner with her once a week, and I'd go and the 2 of us, I'd carefully prepare her Manhattan, and then we'd clink our glasses, and she always had a list. And she'd always say, "I have a list." And so she'd read the list. "Did you read this article?" And she really stayed up on things. In the last year, she was watching so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And so I have a list. So she'd say, "Did you read this article?" I mean, this was just, a month ago. And then she'd say, "Did you hear so-and-so died?" And And then she'd say, I won $6 at bridge on Tuesday, and things like that. And then she was reading the list, and then she says, purgatory. And I said, what about it? And she says, do we still have it? Because I think, I understand limbo. I mean, that was probably worth getting rid of. But I think I need purgatory because I can't directly get to heaven. I'm going to need a place, And so I was so privileged to be the one with her when she died at noon. And a couple of my sisters went out to get lunch, and she was asleep, and then all of a sudden she just sort of let out this tiny, wondrous, glorious gasp, and she left us. And no one in earshot of this sound could ever fear death again. But I mention all that to mention this. In the last couple weeks of her life, whenever one of my siblings would appear and we'd be standing around her bed, she would kind of focus. And with breathless delight, she'd say, oh, you're here. You're here. And I realized that that's the singular agenda item of God. Period. Rest in the stillness of love, and love in the stillness of God. All God wants to do is breathlessly, with great delight, say to you, you're here. I think that's it. And so you receive the tender glance of God, and then you decide to be the tender glance of God in the world. And I think that's it. And once we choose to be the tender glance of God in the world, then there's not much choice about it. You want to create God's dream come true, that you may be one, as Jesus says. But our God gets tiny, and the homies have instructed me so much over the last 34 years of having them in my life. I was at Houston once, and I was talking to a hardcore gang intervention worker, former gang member, former felon, and he was working with gang members in the streets, and he pleaded with me after one of my talks there, how do you reach them? And I said, well, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them? And I think that's the whole thing. And then everybody kind of enters this mutual, exquisite mutuality where we are choosing to live in each other's hearts. And we don't just love. Tenderness is the finishing touch. But the homies have taught me so much, and usually it comes by way of mangling of the English language. I think the title of this talk was Barking to the Choir, which is my title of my new book, which happened because a homie in the bakery was sent to my office because he was coloring outside the lines and late and missing and a bad attitude. So I was running it down to him, and he's standing in front of my desk, and he stops me, and he says, relax, you're barking to the choir. And so I wrote a little note to self, title of next book. I didn't know what the book would be about. I just knew that would be the title. So the homies are always, like there's a homie named Gus who tells these very long shaggy dog stories. And when he gets to the end at a place where he's supposed to say, and lo and behold, he always says, and holy befold. Which I like, but they always kind of mangle. I had a homegirl named Lisa who's part of our 18-month training program, a gang member, and she came into my office at the end of the day. She wanted to introduce her man to me, and she said, "This is my sufficient other." I said, "No doubt." What allows me to travel with my two sons over here is the fact that I have a CEO named Tom Volso who kind of runs the place. We're now a $19 million annual operation, and so it's nice to have him worry about cash flow and budgets and such, so I don't have to. And so I had a homeboy, one of our trainees, a gang member, came in early in the morning and said, "Damn, gee, my lady, she is in a bad mood today." I said, "Why?" "Well, you know, she's beginning her administration period." I said, "Well, I just finished mine, so kind of know what she's going through." But my favorite one, and it has to do with the topic at hand, which is our spacious God, happened when I was presiding at the Eucharist at San Fernando Juvenile Hall, and we were in this large gym, and about 500 kids, mainly gang members and mainly males. I think there might have been 2 rows of females. And so I'm vested. I have my stole and my alb, and I'm sitting on this little folding chair. And I said to myself, well, I'm going to close my eyes, and I'm going to listen to the homies come up and proclaim the word. And they have these little sheets that have the readings in them, in English on one side, Spanish on the other. And I thought, well, I'm just going to have this rest on my lap, and I closed my eyes, and the first kid got up and did the first reading, and then the guy came up to do the psalm response, and I'm noticing kind of an overabundance of confidence in this guy, and he gets up and he says, "The Lord is exhausted." So I grabbed the sheet, I said, "What the hell?" And it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because I think if you think about it, the exalted God is really the God created in our own image. You mentioned Anne Lamont, and I've been privileged to know her as a friend over these many years. And she always says that you know you've created God in your own image when God hates all the same people you do. But let's face it, if any one of us happened to be God, we would want to be exalted. Heck, we're not even God, and we want to be exalted, you know. And yet, I love this sort of exhausted God, you know, extensive, focused on the other, generous, self-kenosis of Jesus. It's all this kind of other-centered, tireless giving. That is a better God than the one we have. And it's important to always allow that to grow in us so that we can move to receiving the tender glance of God and then being that tender glance in the world. But we're always trying to bridge the distance, and that's God's dream come true. Because there's distance even in service. You know, service provider, service recipient. We don't even want there to be daylight in that. Service is a good place to begin, of course, you know, but service is the hallway that gets you to the ballroom. You want to get to the ballroom, which is the place of kinship and exquisite mutuality, where there is no us and them, there's just us. At Homeboy Industries, I'm not the great healer, and those gang members over there are in need of my exquisite healing. The truth be told, we're all a cry for help. We're all in need of healing. It's one of the things that joins us together as members of the human family. We don't go to the margins to make a difference. We go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make us different. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend. He was absolutely the best listener I've ever been in the presence of. If you were talking to Cesar Chavez, nobody else existed. Laser beam focused. He was never looking over your shoulder to see if someone more important was on the approach. But once, quite famously, he was talking to a reporter who commented to him and said, "Wow, these farm workers, they sure love you." And Cesar just shrugged and smiled and said, "The feeling's mutual." And indeed it is. How do we arrive at this mutuality where there is no daylight that separates us? In the Old Testament, you get the covenantal relationship articulated in this way. As I have loved you, our exhausted God says to us. The exalted God would say, love me back. But no, that's not the God we have. The God we actually have says, as I have loved you, so must you have a special preferential care and love for the widow, orphan, and the stranger. And God identifies these three subgroupings, if you will, of the poor, because God knows these are the folks who know what it's like to have been cut off. And because they have suffered in this particular way, God thinks they're trustworthy guides to lead the rest of us to the kinship of God. So you don't go to the margins to make a difference and rescue and save. You go there because that's where the guides are waiting to lead the rest of us. That's why it's important to bridge any kind of distance and not allow there to be any daylight separating us, even service provider, service recipient. No homie found more job opportunities than a guy we all called Dreamer, and he grew up in the housing projects of the part of the parish where I was pastor. He got into a gang at about 13, and super smart kid, though I don't recall that he ever went to school, but he was smart, with a dangerous sense of humor, which is usually the measure of how smart people are. And so he's in his 40s now and doing well and married and a house and a good construction job. But in his early 20s, he was kind of a yo-yo, in and out of being locked up. He'd come to me and I'd find him a job in the private sector or in one of our 9 social enterprises at Homeboy Industries. But he'd always gravitate back to vague criminality, usually something involving drugs, the sale of or the use of, and then he'd wander back to me. So this was kind of a frustrating yo-yo pattern that was going on quite a bit. So this one time he finished a 4-month stretch of probation violation in county jail, and there he is sitting in front of my desk. And he says what gang members often say, this time it'll be different. And I go, well, all right. So with him sitting there, I pick up the phone, and I call a friend of mine named Gary, who owns a vending machine company in Alhambra, California, and he had hired homies in the past. I'm hoping against hope, maybe he'll do it again. And sure enough, Gary says, you tell that guy he can start tomorrow. That's a holy man right there. So Dreamer began work the very next day at the vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, there he is again in front of my desk. I could not even believe it. I said, Híjole, Madre Santa, here we go all over again. But this time he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out his very first paycheck and he waves it proudly. And he says, damn, gee, this paycheck makes me feel proper. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. You know who I have to thank for this job. And I said, well, gosh, you know, who? And he looked at me strangely and he said, well, God, of course. I said, oh, no, that's right. That would be God, yeah. You thought I was going to say you. I said, no, gosh, no, God's number one. You are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days. I'm sorry, them Genesis days? He goes, yeah, because God would have had struck down your ass already by now, he said. Well, we just howled with laughter, and I fell out of my chairs. We both fell out of our chairs. And I defy you to identify exactly who's the service provider, who's the service recipient. I have no idea, because it's mutual. So Homeboy was started a long time ago, 1988. This is our 30th year we're celebrating. And started when I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city, Dolores Mission. 2 huge housing projects, the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other, half of them enemies. And I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988, and I buried my 255th 2 months ago. Not all from that community, but I know a lot of gang members. I get asked to do this. My parish was had the highest concentration of gang activity in all of LA. So there are 120,000 gang members in LA County, 1,100 gangs. So if LA was the gang capital of the world, my parish was the gang capital of Los Angeles. So we did a lot of things. First thing we did was we started a school because there were so many junior high, middle school age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them. So they were wreaking havoc in the projects. They were writing on the walls, selling drugs. They were violent. So I walked out to them and I would kind of isolate them one at a time. I'd say, hey, you know, if I found a school that would take you, would you go? And to my surprise, every single one said, yeah, you know, I would. And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so that kind of forced my hand. So across the street from the church is our parochial school, our elementary school, K-8, which were the 2 first floors of the building. But the entire 3rd floor was the convent. And so I gather all the nuns and I sit them down in the living room. And I said, hey, you know, would you guys mind, you know, moving out? And we could turn the convent into a school for gang members. And they looked at each other and they went, sure. And that was the extent of their discernment process. And so then brought gang members in large numbers, enemies. It was a tough school, fights all the time. And which kind of created a disconnect for the parish. You know, the parishioners started to say, wait, aren't parishes, churches, supposed to be hermetically sealed, good people in and bad people out? So that was a good gospel challenge. And so then they kept saying, if only we had jobs. So myself and the women in the parish, we marched around the factories that surrounded the housing projects, trying to find felony-friendly employers. And that wasn't so forthcoming. So we invented things, you know, like a maintenance crew and landscaping crew and a graffiti removal crew and a crew to build our child care center, all made up of rival enemy gang members from the 8 gangs in the parish. So then in '92, after the Rodney King verdict, there was huge unrest. Every pocket of poverty in Los Angeles exploded, but not the projects where Dolores Mission was. So the LA Times came to ask me, why didn't this, the most likely place to explode, why didn't it? So I said, well, I think it's because we had 60 strategically hired gang members from rival gangs working side by side. So they had a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to gangbang the night before, and more to the point of your question, a reason not to torch their own community. So the next day, a movie producer named Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million, summoned me to his office in Beverly Hills. And he said, how should I use my money? I look back now and I see how I woefully undershot my request. But I was young. I said, well, there's an abandoned bakery just across the street from the school. It has ovens. We could put hairnets on rival enemy gang members. They could bake bread. We could call the thing, I don't know, Homeboy Bakery. And that was the extent of my business plan. And he said, sure. So we were off and running. And so we began. A month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in Grand Central Market. Once we had plural, we changed our name from previously we called ourselves Jobs for a Future, and we changed the name to Homeboy Industries. Nobody ever intends to do such a thing, but Homeboy sort of evolved, into this big, huge thing. And we tried a lot of things, Not every enterprise worked. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. But now we've sort of evolved into becoming the largest gang intervention rehab reentry program on our planet. So 15,000 folks a year walk through our doors wanting to catch the crumb of hope that falls from the table. The centerpiece, of course, is the 18-month training program. And folks want to be a part of that because it's a paid gig. But then we have free tattoo removal. No place on the planet Earth removes more tattoos than we do. Designated clinic, 3 laser machines, 1 paid physician assistant, but 47 volunteer doctors. So if any of you are starting to regret that Holy Communion tattoo you have, see me afterwards. And there are like 40 classes: anger management, parenting, different things, GED. We still have a school. Therapy, everybody's in therapy. Case management. And then our 9 social enterprises, Homeboy Bakery, Homeboy Silk Screen, Homeboy Homegirl Merchandise, where we sell our logo stuff. Homeboy, we have a restaurant at LAX Terminal 4, Homeboy Diner, the only place you can get food at City Hall. Farmers markets, we have Homeboy Recycling, which is e-waste. Solar panel installation training program. What am I missing? I was just checking to see if you're listening. I can't remember what else. Oh, we have a gluten-free bakery. Very good. I never mentioned that. That's good. Wow. Glad I brought you. And Homegirl Cafe, where women with records, young ladies from rival gangs, waitresses with attitude will gladly take your order. I'm going to just show of hands if anybody. Has anybody been there? There you are, way back there. How great. How great. Thank you. It's good. It's kind of a who's who. If you go there, you're going to run into Jim Carrey or Jack Black or Forrest Whitaker, movie stars or electeds. Once, with only 2 hours' notice, we got a phone call from Secret Service telling us that Vice President Joe Biden, when he was vice president, was going to wanted to have lunch at the famous Homegirl Cafe. And so entourage and Secret Service and selfies with Uncle Joe. And I wasn't there. I was making my annual 8-day silent retreat. So when I came back, I ran into Louis Mora, one of the trainees, and he said, damn, gee, while you were gone, we were visited by an MVP. Do you mean a VIP? That one, yeah. He goes, damn, do you imagine here at Homeboy Industries, we were visited by the Vice President of the United States, Mick Romney. I think you might be able to file that one under all white guys look alike, but... And I think we may have added a current affairs course shortly thereafter, but most famously of all, Diane Keaton came once, Oscar winner, movie star, Godfather movies, Annie Hall. Her waitress is Glenda, and Glenda's a big girl and been there, done that, tattooed felon, gang member. She has no idea who Diane Keaton is, and so she's taking her order, and Diane Keaton says, well, what do you recommend? And Glenda rattles off the 3 dishes that she really likes, and Diane Keaton says, I'll have that second one. That one sounds really good. And it's at that moment, for some reason, something dawns on Glenda, and she looks at Diane Keaton. She says, wait a minute. I feel like I know you from somewhere. You know, like maybe we've met. And Diane Keaton decides to deflect it humbly. Oh, gosh, I don't know. I suppose I have one of those faces that people think they've seen before. And then Glenda goes, no, now I know. We were locked up together. Yeah, that just took my breath away when I heard it, and I don't believe we've had any further Diane Keaton sightings now that I think of it. But suddenly, kinship so quickly, Oscar-winning actress, attitudinal waitress, exactly what God had in mind, that you may be one. All of us are called to be enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves. At Homeboy, we're kind of allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking homies to measure up. Instead, we want to just show up and hold the mirror up and tell folks the truth, knowing that my truth is your truth and your truth is a gang member's truth. It's all the same truth, and here's the truth. You are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And then you watch folks on the margins as they become that truth, as they inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it, no 4 prison walls can keep it out, and death can't touch it because it's huge. But at Homeboy, we know that part of the task always, daily, is to reach in and to dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. You dismantle it with the highest form of spiritual maturity, which is tenderness. We receive the tender glance, we extend that tender glance to another. In the Acts of the Apostles, it says oddly, and awe came upon everyone. It seems to suggest that the measure of the health of any community at all may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. Some years ago, I was invited to speak in Richmond, Virginia, to 600 social workers, and it was one of those gang in services, so it was like from 9 to 5 at a hotel ballroom. I figured they're inviting me to maybe give a keynote or speak at lunch or close the day. So I said yes, and I bought my ticket. A week before I was to fly to Richmond, I pull out the letter, and to my horror, I read the letter a little more carefully, and it said that I was to be the only speaker all damn day. And I said to myself, oh, hell no, I'm not going to do that. So I invited two homies in, Andre and Jose, both trainees in our 18-month training program. And I sat them down and I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up and tell your stories. Take your time. Because we have a long-ass day to fill. Well, I'd never heard their stories, and Jose gets up, and I think at the time he was probably about 25 years old, and, you know, he was probably in his 16th month of his 18 months. He was towards the end, and he was kind of found himself to be quite a valuable member of our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery, and now helping younger homies with their addiction issues. And, you know, gang member, been to prison, tattooed, but he also had a long stretch of time as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he got up in front of 600 social workers and he said, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasped. And he says, it sounds way worse in Spanish. And we got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. I think I was 9, he said, when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage, and she knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door, and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through. Second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion. And he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. And they are our trustworthy guides. I think it was Vanity Fair, they did a Q&A with Whoopi Goldberg, and they asked her, name the living person you most admired. I suppose she could have said a lot of people, but she said, Pope Francis. And then she said, yeah, he's going with the original program. Now, whatever you think about Pope Francis or anything else, everybody knows what the original program is. We want to take seriously what Jesus took seriously. Inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, compassionate acceptance. If we take those things seriously, then we're taking seriously what Jesus took seriously. It's the original program. I was interviewed once on the Christian Broadcasting Network by this nice lady, and she asked me, what do you do at Homeboy Industries? So I talked about all the things I talked to you about, you know, the largest gang intervention program, 15,000 folks a year, enemies, rivals working side by side with each other, people coming to terms with what was done to them and what they did, attachment repair, healing in a community of tenderness, tattoo removal, therapy, case management, 9 social enterprises where folks who used to shoot at each other bake croissants together. I went on and on and on like that. Finally, when I stopped, she said, yeah, but how much time each day do you spend at Homeboy Industries? You know, praising God. And I didn't know what to say, so I said, all damn day. And I don't believe she liked that answer very much. But it begs the question, what kind of praise does our exhausted God have any interest in? And I'll end with this story, and then I'll invite my brothers up here. So, you know, I have a second book now, but when I had one book, it would occur mainly to universities to force their students to read my book against their will. And I'm not complaining, but so my alma mater, which I've pegged to be in the Final Four, Gonzaga University in Spokane, they invited me to speak there. And so they were going to have a huge venue on a Tuesday night, promising 1,000 people will come. And all the freshmen were forced to read Tattoos on the Heart. So they said, can you come and speak? I said, sure. Can you bring 2 homies with you? And so I do when people are going to pay for it, you know. And so I you know, always try to pick homies in the same way. You know, normally I pick enemies, rivals, just to force them to share a hotel room together, just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky. Wasn't that long ago when I was at LAX airport and with 2 older guys from Homeboy, and one of them says to me, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? I said, well, yes, actually it's a requirement. We'll be returning on American. So I've done this hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times with men and women, and I pick Bobby, an African-American gang member who worked in the bakery at the time, and Mario, who at the time worked in our merchandise store in our headquarters. And I've done this so many times. I have never had anybody fly with me who was so absolutely petrified that it was scaring me, Mario was just beside himself. I mean, in fact, he was hyperventilating, and we hadn't even boarded the plane yet. So we go to Burbank Airport, which is kind of a small airport and big bay windows, Southwest Airlines mainly. And they don't have that hermetically sealed chute, to board the plane. You have to walk out onto the tarmac like you're the president. And they have the stairs that go to the big planes, but the stairs that go to the front of the plane and stairs that go to the back of the plane. And so I'm sitting there with Mario, and Bobby's off walking somewhere in the airport, and our plane arrives, and I go, "Hey, Mario, that's our plane." And I think, wow, he may die before we climb those stairs. And so I see our flight crew arrives. It's, again, early morning, and I see two female flight attendants. Both of them have very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the front steps to get onto the plane. And Mario goes, "When are we going to board the plane?" I said, "Well, as soon as they sober up the pilots." There they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that, but I should tell you that in our 30-year history as an organization, Mario is the most tattooed individual who's ever worked there, which, trust me, is saying a lot. And he's all sleeved out. His arms are completely covered with tattoos. Neck blackened with the name of his gang. Head shaved, covered in tattoos. Forehead, chin, cheeks, eyelids that say "the end," so that when finally he's at rest in a coffin, people will see the end. So I had never been in public with him, and so he and I was trying to calm him down, and people were like this, and mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely, and which is very interesting, because if you were to go to Homeboy tomorrow and ask anybody there, who's the kindest, most gentle, tender soul who works here, they won't say me. They'll think for a second and then say, "Yeah, Mario." He currently works behind the counter in the cafe selling baked goods. He's proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. So we get to Gonzaga, and this only always happens. The big talk Tuesday night, 1,000 people. What they don't tell you is, there's like 93 other talks in the course of the day. This class, this lunch, this meeting, this class, all day. So I tell these two, look, I'm not going to speak. I'm going to speak mainly tonight, so you guys get up and tell your stories. And so I sat in the back of the classroom, and they told stories of terror and torture and violence and abuse of every imaginable kind. I would not have survived a day of their childhood. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance, otherwise you'd get scorched. So the nighttime comes, and so I had them get up just like Omar and Jason. And they told their stories, and they did a good job. So that after I did my thing, I'd invite them up, which is what I did. So they were on either side of me, and and a woman, "Yes, ma'am." So a woman stands, and she goes, "Yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario." First question out the gates for Mario. And Mario is this skinny, tall drink of water. He steps up to the microphone, he clutches the microphone. Yes. And he's just terrified. And she says, well, you say you're a father and you have a son and a daughter. They're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? You know, what advice do you give them? Mario closes his eyes and he clutches the microphone even more tightly, and he's trembling, and I can just feel, you know, the emotion, and he's getting a damn hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell answer he wants to give, when suddenly he blurts out, and as soon as he says those two words, he retreats back to his microphone clutching, closed-eyed retreat. And now I know he's losing this battle with his tears, but he wants to get the whole sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. And she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. And they in turn were returned to themselves, which shouldn't surprise us because it's mutual. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. It's the original program. Inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, compassionate acceptance. The widow, orphan, and the stranger, trustworthy guides to lead the rest of us to God's dream come true, kinship. We don't go to the margins to make a difference. We go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make us different. And pretty soon we cease to care whether anyone accuses us of wasting our time. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. We go to the margins, we look under our feet, the margins get erased, and other voices get heard. Thank you very much. Stand on either side and then